Um, Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. I'm Gwen Robinson, past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand and editor-at-large of Nikkei Asia. We're here this afternoon to welcome UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner, who has just come from Afghanistan on a swing through also Thailand. I'd just like to very briefly say that Mr. Steiner became administrator of UNDP in June 2017, and in 2021 April the General Assembly confirmed his appointment to a second four-year term beginning June 21. He is also the Vice Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which brings together 40 entities of the UN system working to support sustainable development. Over nearly 3 decades, he's been a key voice in international circles on sustainable development, climate resilience, and international cooperation, championing sustainability, economic growth, and equality for the vulnerable. He's also been a vocal advocate for sustainable development goals. Before he joined UNDP, he was director of the Oxford Martin School and professorial fellow of Balliol College, University of Oxford. And he has served across the UN system, looking at global challenges from both a humanitarian and development perspective. He's lived and worked in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Latin America, and the US, and graduated in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University and holds an MA from the University of London, SOAS. So with that, I would like to turn to Mr. Steiner to give us his take on your recent experiences in the last week. Over to you.
Thank you. This is on? Yes. Thank you very much, Gwen. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for what is a little bit of an attempt to share perhaps some insights about both what is happening in particular places right now, but also what is unfolding around us in terms of the context that we in the United Nations at the moment are trying to respond to on multiple fronts. The world is trying to cope in terms of its consequences, and people in different countries are desperately struggling to survive despite what is happening right now. Why do I begin like this? Because my visit to Afghanistan earlier this week was in one sense to a particular place, but was actually also connected to the very fact that right now a war is raging in the Ukraine. Russia has invaded the Ukraine, and the ripple effects are not only causing extraordinary grief, pain, and destruction in the Ukraine. We are actually beginning to see a war in less than 4 weeks affect virtually every corner of the world, be it through energy prices, food prices, the supply chain challenges that are emerging. And at the same time, yesterday, the United Nations, together with Qatar, Germany, and the United Kingdom, hosted a pledging conference for Afghanistan, a desperately needed injection of funding in order to enable the United Nations to continue to respond to what is an almost unprecedented economic implosion, certainly in the history of Afghanistan since the events of last August. A humanitarian caseload that literally within weeks went into the millions, and close to half the population of Afghanistan is now dependent in one form or another on support. We have a very real prospect of not just hunger beginning to kill people, but actually to become potentially a famine if the situation is not addressed. UNDP at the end of last year published a set of scenarios that indicated that somewhere between the middle and the end of 2022, 95+% of Afghanistan's population could be living below the poverty line. And the latest indications are that it will not take till the end of the year for that scenario to actually come true, unless we're able to, one, sustain the humanitarian response, but also scale up a basic needs approach. This is a terminology that member states have chosen to use in order to be able to find a way to describe what is not a resumption of development cooperation with a country whose de facto authorities are not recognized by any single country at the moment, and therefore also not by the United Nations. And yet 40 million Afghans find themselves in a nation that is in economic freefall since last August. A central bank that has collapsed, a private banking system that is to all intents and purposes paralyzed. Cash is not circulating. The country is cut off from 9 billion of its foreign reserves. A de facto authority that now runs the country, with whom we are able to operate in terms of practical and pragmatic dialogue, but the work that the United Nations is doing through its humanitarian response, but also the work that UNDP is currently implementing with direct implementation with communities, with women's chambers of commerce, with NGOs, are essentially activities that are meant to help people stay alive, but also to preserve livelihoods. And what I mean by that is that humanitarian aid is first and foremost about saving lives. It is unconditional. It tries to essentially respond to an emergency. But what we're seeing in Afghanistan is such a catastrophic economic implosion that there is no way that 40 million people can be, in a sense, kept alive from outside alone. We need to find ways in which we can help people to recover and rebuild some resilience from the ground up by communities, in farming households, with micro and small enterprises. Most of those, by the way, are women-led in Afghanistan, and therefore a very strong focus also in the economic support that we are trying to develop right now through cash for work programs, through direct grants to these micro and small enterprises, assisting women in being able to obtain some of the inputs that allow them to actually continue to produce and earn a livelihood. These are the kinds of activities that will allow people to earn at least the basic minimum to survive, and thereby not become dependent on essentially handouts and donations. Our objective in saving lives and saving livelihoods at the moment is to try and address the immediacy of survival for many, and there are literally millions right now, while also trying to keep that caseload from growing even bigger. Now, as you also know, the humanitarian appeal was for $4.4 billion, and unfortunately, the international community pledged $2.44 billion, which is just over half of what is required for the next year. And this comes on the back also of a humanitarian pledging conference for Yemen a few days earlier, where less than 1/3 of the amount was actually pledged that was asked for in the appeal. I mention these figures because I think we are now going to face a situation in the coming months where the war in Ukraine is not only a tragedy for those affected by it in Ukraine, but we are seeing increasingly the ripple effects, not only in terms of the global marketplace on energy and food prices. We're also beginning to see that, particularly amongst the wealthiest nations in the world, who traditionally are the backbone of financing humanitarian and development cooperation, there's a growing tendency to argue that they will prioritize financing on the crisis around Ukraine. This is extremely troubling for us because the war in Ukraine has not led to other conflicts and crises from continuing. We live in a world in April 2022 that is characterized by an unusual degree of conflict, of catastrophe, of humanitarian caseloads that are growing exponentially, of record numbers of refugees and internally displaced people. It is quite an extraordinary moment, and I think it is critical that the United Nations speak to the world about these multiple crises. Turning our backs on them may be something that is comfortable to some, but ultimately cannot be justified by the international community. So I share this with you, and I'll happily answer further questions on Afghanistan, should you have any. Let me for a moment just pivot to the Kingdom of Thailand. We meet here in Bangkok at a moment in time when the COVID-19 pandemic is just beginning to release its very strong stranglehold on people, economy, and life here in the city. And yet it reminds us that, in fact, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. COVID-19 has been catastrophic in so many parts of the world in terms of health, people's well-being, in terms of death. But actually the social and economic tale of this COVID pandemic is still playing out in so many ways. And for me, these 2 days here in Bangkok were an opportunity to engage in meetings with government leaders, partly to understand how Thailand, how the kingdom managed its way through this pandemic, and secondly also how it sees the way forward, because as you may recall, the Prime Minister of Thailand, just before the Glasgow COP, made an announcement that put Thailand really in a group of countries that are now at the forefront of trying to address the challenge of climate change, the transition towards cleaner energy systems. And yet here we are in April with record energy prices, with questions being raised about the dependency on fossil fuel on the other side, but also the displacement effect that this current crisis may have on objectives about moving rapidly towards a decarbonized economy, investing in renewable energy infrastructure. And in my meetings with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Environment, with the Finance Minister, I listened very carefully how an economy such as this one tries to navigate both the continued challenges of the pandemic, but also on how to invest forward at this critical moment in time. As you have heard the Secretary General repeatedly argue, climate change is the single greatest threat to humanity, to our economies, to our common future, and therefore he has argued strongly and repeatedly for greater commitments, greater ambition, and therefore the need for countries to really embrace the pathway of decarbonization, of transitions towards cleaner energy economies. And yet here we are, and we clearly are in a situation where many countries will begin to hesitate whether they have the means to do so. Our analysis in January in terms of countries' debt levels indicated that 82 countries, developing countries right now, are debt vulnerable. That implies potentially being 1 or 2 steps away from defaulting. This is a very narrow line that countries may have to cross, because fiscal space, that term that became so frequently cited during the pandemic, is still as constrained as it was then. In some ways it is worse than it was a year ago, because not only do countries continue to have to deal with the fallout of the pandemic, they're also dealing with essentially budgets and debts that they have incurred in order to cope with the pandemic that still need to be repaid. Something that is also true for the Kingdom of Thailand, but let me be very clear, Thailand is not one of those countries on that list, but it increased its debt burden, and it is also very keen to try and, as soon as possible, bring it down to a pre-pandemic level again. So, again, we are extremely concerned that as the world prepares for COP27 later this year, whether climate change may actually suffer a setback in terms of the commitments and the ambition levels that Glasgow tried to both maintain and even accelerate. 2 scenarios are possible. We lose momentum, or we may find ourselves coming together as an international community on the issue of climate change that remains one of the few on which everybody will be a loser if we cannot progress as an international community. This puts a great deal of weight on the UK presidency and the Egyptian presidency that will be convening COP27. And I think countries like Thailand will have an extraordinarily important role as a key player in the international climate change discussion, but also with the targets that it set for itself. So we are obviously, as UNDP, also here in Thailand with our strong presence, very keen to accompany Thailand in how it wishes to proceed with implementing its BCG transitions towards a green economy, but also how it wishes to pursue the decarbonization path, the transition in terms of energy matrix for the country. Last point I just want to make is that I expect will be of interest to you. I mentioned at the beginning the multiplicity of conflicts and of crises across the world. There is another country, Myanmar, right next door to the Kingdom of Thailand, that continues to be of major concern to the United Nations. Again, you have heard the Secretary General repeatedly call for return to democracy, a release of politicians who have been detained, and yet in reality we see that very little progress has occurred, that the economic situation again is deteriorating rapidly, partly as a result of COVID. Poverty levels are rising, particularly affecting also women and women-led households. We see particularly in rural areas also and in the informal sector continuously eroding income levels and the ability to operate as small and medium-scale enterprises. And again, our scenarios indicate right now that Myanmar could lose in the next 1 or 2 years literally a decade in its development gains. These are, the kind of setbacks that not only are GDP statistics, these are numbers that translate into millions of people being worse off. And this is not to address the reality of being a citizen in Myanmar at this moment in time. But I wanted to briefly touch on that because Myanmar is yet another one of the places across our international community where we are struggling to respond to the humanitarian and development needs of a country, but are essentially unable to work in a normal fashion because no country has recognized the de facto authorities that are ruling Myanmar at the moment. So let me stop here and hopefully be able to respond to any questions that you have or any further information I can provide on any of the 3 topics I've touched on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner. As the moderator, I'll just take a prerogative to just do a quick follow-up. I think listening to you on Afghanistan and the figures is very sobering indeed, but it also evokes, as you said at the end, the crisis in Myanmar, which interests a lot of people in this room in particular. And UNDP itself issued one of the strongest and most comprehensive reports last year, warning of the impending deterioration of the situation, particularly on poverty and other fronts, and made it clear it was the result of both COVID and the military takeover of February the 1st, 21. I just wonder if you had further, you've got some very sobering figures out of Afghanistan on warnings about poverty levels, etc. And I wonder if you have further outlook on the situation in Myanmar.
As of today, not yet new figures. What I signaled to you, and perhaps this is more an anticipation of a further set of analysis that we are in fact conducting right now, including with household surveys in order to determine, because statistics, data, the official business of government is simply not accessible to us at the moment. So the UN country team, as we refer to our agencies, funds and programs working in Myanmar, are working at the moment on trying to ascertain what has been the impact over the last 6 months of the further deterioration of the economy. And so I would ask you for some patience, because I anticipate that in probably about 2 or 3 weeks this report will become available. The latest is that we continue to estimate that about half the population, or about 25 million people, live in poverty in the Myanmar of today. Of those, 14 million are considered extremely vulnerable, and over 800,000 people are currently internally displaced, and that may be an underestimate, a number that has more than doubled since the coup last year. And there are also particular parts of the country, the situation in Rakhine, not surprisingly, remains particularly troubling, and UNDP has estimated that up to 2/3 of the state's population live below the poverty line now. These are just some of the statistics behind which lie endless tragic stories about individual livelihoods, families, children not having enough to eat. It is a drama that continues to unfold and to deteriorate. But I would not wish to go further in terms of numbers, because I believe that in a few weeks' time we will have updated numbers, and that will provide you with the latest in terms of where we believe the situation stands.
Thank you. With that, we are open to questions from the floor. Please identify yourselves. Tony, the microphone's up there. Would that be okay? Yeah, that would be great. And
Tony Davis, I write for the Jane's Defence Publications in Bangkok. I've got a couple of questions on Afghanistan. They're sort of a double-barrel question, if you like. First of all, I'd like your impressions on the capacity of the Taliban regime to deal with the gravity of the problems that they face now, both in terms of what they're doing in Kabul, but also what they're doing provincially. And the other side of that question is, do you feel that in the coming months and year, perhaps, that the scale of these problems is going to result in the insurgents facing their own insurgency? In other words, that people will actually act against the Taliban regime because the situation has become so desperate. Thank you.
Let me briefly say that in being in Kabul and also having spent a day in Mazar-i-Sharif, it is quite clear that the de facto authorities, I'll use that term because this is how we officially refer to the leadership of that country right now, have asserted their control over the country as a whole. And that in some ways has also enabled the United Nations agencies, non-governmental organizations to actually travel across the country in ways that hadn't been possible in recent years. The security situation in that sense is one that has changed from before. Having said that, since last August, there clearly is a Taliban leadership that is asserting itself, appointing governors and officials in various capacities. But I think it is fair to say that, first of all, many of those who are currently being appointed in these positions are in no way professionals, not public administration officials, as you can imagine. And therefore, both experience and ability to run local government, national government entities is still severely constrained. Let me also make it very clear here that neither the United Nations as a whole nor any individual agency currently recognizes these national authorities, and we do not implement any of these programs through any central government ministry whatsoever. The humanitarian support, the basic needs support that we currently implement, we do so directly through direct implementation, as I said earlier on, with local partners, or as WFP, for instance, does through distribution, or UNHCR or UNICEF through the clinics. And what we do, however, is obviously liaise. This is normal in any country, and this is not the first time that the United Nations operates in a country where, as a result of conflict or coup d'etats, de facto authorities are in place. This is part of our modus operandi, that we are able to engage with de facto authorities without recognizing them, but certainly at this moment no funding goes through them, and the funding that is mobilized by the international community is used to provide directly support. So I think does the leadership, the de facto authorities, recognize the gravity of the situation? I think a number of them do, and as is the case with the movement, when it assumes the role of a de facto government, there are very different people who will now be in charge. I've had discussions with members of the de facto authority that were extremely clear in their mind how grave the economic situation has become. The attribution and the cause of this then becomes a matter of perspective. For many of them, it is the fact that the foreign currency reserves are frozen, that they cannot access the $9 billion, but also recognition that the drought, COVID-19, there are many factors that have compounded this. But let us also remember, until August of last year, 75% of Afghanistan's government budget was aid funded. You turn that tap off overnight, you have essentially shut down government. Through the sanctions and also the rapid departure of so many professionals and the economic sanctions, the central bank has ceased operating. Through no cash availability and also the financial system not being able to be regulated properly, the private commercial banking system has, to all intents and purposes, imploded. So there is no cash circulating in this economy. So wherever you want to look for, the origins of this problem, the causes are multiple. The situation, including the political reality, has amplified this and certainly is contributing to a further deterioration. The scale of the problem is escalating. As I said, we undertook a survey last year, published a set of scenarios, and continue to maintain that the likelihood of well over 90% of Afghans' population living below the poverty line in the year 2022 is almost a certainty if nothing dramatic changes in the next few months. And from that point of view, I think it is a hypothetical or it is a speculative whether this will give rise to another insurgency, as you refer to it, Tony. I think what is quite clear is that it will certainly create another wave of desperation within the country, initially with internal displacement, people having to give up on their houses, their homes, their fields, their villages, and having to move into provincial capitals in order to queue up for some form of rations, and perhaps ultimately deciding that they have no future in Afghanistan, and then triggering that next wave of refugees that could be in the hundreds of thousands or indeed in millions, because the economic situation has become unbearable and is not changing. So the appeal this week that the United Nations had launched, our engagement in the country right now on behalf of the international community, is also an attempt to step in where others currently feel unable to act, and to do so in the interests of the people of Afghanistan, but also of the international community. Whether ultimately that will lead to the resurgence of extremists and their ability to operate from within Afghanistan, I will leave that to other services in national capitals that are perhaps better able to determine that. But I think it would not be the first time that such a vacuum obviously can give rise to a further deterioration in the security context of a country, and therefore let us hope that we will not get to that point. I hope I've answered your questions with that.
Yeah, one quick additional point. I mean, has the situation reached the point where people are starving to death today?
The question was, has the situation reached the point where people are starving to death?
Yes. Is starvation a reality in Afghanistan today?
For a limited number of people, it's a very imminent risk. Our colleagues in the World Food Programme, Martin Griffiths, our humanitarian coordinator with whom I was in Kabul during earlier this week, visited hospitals where literally babies and little children were on a drip with signs of severe malnutrition. And given that we are only, how do you say, progressively able to reach remoter parts of the country, we assume that in some parts of the country the situation is literally desperate enough to say that people are not able to feed themselves adequately. We have, obviously, in the United Nations a very rigorous system of defining famines, and therefore I don't want to use terminology right now that is not yet substantiated by the empirical evidence. But is there desperation? Is there a reality where millions of people, not 10,000, not 100,000, millions of people are unable to feed themselves properly? Yes, that moment is already there.
Right, thank you. May.
Hi, good evening. May Wong from CNA, Channel News Asia, Singapore. Just wanted to take you back to Myanmar. I've got two questions for you, really. My first question is, you mentioned earlier that Myanmar remains a major concern for the United Nations, but yet at this point, when the UN appealed for some $57 million worth of funding, less than 10% of that has been met thus far. Given what you said earlier about the distractions from Afghanistan as well as from Ukraine, how do you expect to keep up this focus as well as this momentum going to shore up perhaps more support and a lot more concentration on Myanmar? That's my first question. My second question is, at this stage it appears that ASEAN is dependent on the United Nations to work out some kind of humanitarian, perhaps, corridor. I hate to use that word, but that's what has been said a lot. ASEAN is dependent on the UN to create this humanitarian corridor. The United Nations is dependent on ASEAN to create that humanitarian corridor. At what stage and what kind of progress can we expect in the near future, as opposed to having the people wait longer? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Forgive me if I cannot answer your question today, the second part of your question, and I would refer you to my colleague Marlene Heiser, who is the Secretary General's designated representative and who is engaged in very active consultations across ASEAN and indeed internationally on precisely exploring what are options for being able to progress. And I would not wish to step in the way of an ongoing discussion that is happening as we sit here also in Bangkok with international partners. To your first question, how do we keep the momentum going? I was interviewed on the BBC this morning, and my answer to a similar question was, I think we have to appeal to something that is ultimately something we all share in common, a sense of compassion, of empathy, of solidarity, where we can either turn our backs on people by saying this is all too much, or the Taliban are giving us 100 reasons not to engage there, to which I have to respond, no, there are 40 million reasons why we cannot turn our back on the people of Afghanistan right now. And I and my colleague Martin Griffiths, the Secretary General, many NGO leaders also across the world, we need to reach out to the public and say, look, this is an extraordinarily difficult moment. And yes, it is a world that is disrupted and everybody is still struggling with the fallout from COVID. But to argue that we do not have the resources to step up and help people to stay alive is simply not true. I think it's also not justifiable. But for that, we have to reach out to the public. We have to reach people. We have to be able to connect them and their perception to real life stories. I spent the day in Mazar-e-Sharif. I spent the day with roughly 40 women-led entrepreneurs. I call them entrepreneurs because that's what they really are. But what is the story behind them? Many of them are widows. They've lost their husbands. They are caring for 5, 6, 7, 8 people in their family. They've had to create businesses out of nothing in order to feed themselves and the children that they have been left with, or their relatives' children that they are looking after. These are very strong women. They are extraordinarily clear in terms of the focus, the laser focus they have on survival. And they're actually not asking for pity or philanthropy. their request to us was, help us get our business up and running and help us to get the raw materials we cannot obtain right now. Help us to get to markets because at the moment we're not able to sell products. Help us to figure out a way in how we are supposed to operate in an economy where cash is not flowing and circulating. These are women who, through their desperation to stay alive and earn a livelihood, have created tens of thousands of jobs in Afghanistan, and with it livelihoods that keep hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people alive. I think it is in those moments when we are able to connect those stories to people who live in countries where the question is really one of, will I get myself another Starbucks coffee tomorrow, or do I actually think it is the right thing to contribute to helping people to stay alive, that we can change the conversation. You know, statistics, numbers are very abstract. We have to work with those because we are accountable. We have to provide the evidence. This is what the United Nations does. This is what the International Red Cross Federation does. This is what NGOs do, who want to be transparent about what they're doing. But at the end of the day, we have to appeal to people's compassion. And I have to be honest with you, I find it sometimes difficult at the moment to listen to some government officials in certain countries, and I will not cite them here because you know, I wish to observe this a little bit more closely over the next few weeks. But there are countries right now who will be earning from their revenue in terms of oil and gas production 2 to 3 times more revenue than had been anticipated for this year just 6 months ago. That some of these countries now feel that they have a justification to cut their funding for ODA is a fairly incomprehensible set of arguments. But, you know, these are the pressures that perhaps politicians feel within their own countries. But the bottom line for me is we need to persuade people that they can make a difference in the countries that have the ability to finance these humanitarian appeals and these responses, because I have seen with my very own eyes, and my colleagues see it every day, whether it is in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in the Sahel, in Haiti, in Myanmar for that matter, that this international support, this humanitarian support, does save lives. And I think this is time and again the story we have to take back to those who, on whose generosity we ultimately depend to be able to do this work.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Head from the BBC. A couple of questions. First of all, I don't know, are you able to tell us anything about who you were able to meet here in Bangkok on the government side, and whether the humanitarian concerns and talk of humanitarian corridors, which has been around, was discussed, and what kind of response you got? A second question, I wonder if you can elaborate on, just give us some sense of how, in dealing with governments like those in Afghanistan and Myanmar, which are not recognized, and we know that imposes constraints, how that actually prevents you from delivering the kind of help that you need to. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify, my visit to the Kingdom of Thailand here to Bangkok is in my capacity as head of the United Nations Development Program. In that capacity, I engage with the Thai Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Environment, on the development activities of UNDP in Thailand. Myanmar was not part of my interactions with Thailand on this occasion. And as I said, because we have a special envoy, Noeleen Heyzer, I'm not just deferring to her, I refer you to her because she is the person tasked by the Secretary General to lead the United Nations engagement on Myanmar and its neighborhood alongside the ASEAN envoy. So I really am not avoiding the question. I really am just not in a position to offer you anything there. On your question, engaging with de facto authorities, the United Nations is frequently operating in the context of conflict and crisis. For us, it is nothing new to have to operate sometimes with different militias literally in one territory. I would argue that both in Afghanistan and Myanmar, we have a situation where, in the context of Afghanistan, there is not yet a functioning government. There is a leadership, there is an established authority within the country. It's a de facto authority. It obviously makes it much more complex for us and for NGOs to be able to operate in such a context, because we are not able to work through a coordinated central government response using central ministries and the infrastructure, national officials. All of that has to be done independently of government. So yes, it complicates efforts, it makes it more complex, but it does not stop us from doing the work. It is a politically sensitive situation, because clearly you cannot operate in Afghanistan or in Myanmar today without having a form of liaison with these de facto authorities. So far, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, who leads the political mission for Afghanistan, has led that engagement, and at operational level, we are, in a sense, able to operate and to liaise in a very constructive manner at this moment. But things can change very frequently, and let me say again, I deeply regret the decision that the de facto leadership took about a week and a half ago, I think it is now, not to proceed with its own commitment to reopening secondary schools for girls. Not only is it a tragic decision for the girls in Afghanistan, it sent an extremely negative signal to the international community, which was looking towards that commitment as being one that would allow it to look to a future of engagement with, let's say, a degree of constructive engagement. Now, it is also a fact that in Afghanistan today, there is still a very diverse set of leaders in different parts of the country. There are provinces where secondary schools for girls are open. And I spoke to a governor who said, in my province, girls' schools will be opened, and my girls will go to school. The Taliban leadership, the de facto authorities, have committed themselves to education for all. Still, that announcement was a major setback. It is for the de facto authorities now to signal whether it was just a delay for technical reasons. And during my visit to Afghanistan, I made it very clear, if there are constraints that prevent these schools from being open, I think the United Nations family will be the first ones to immediately step up and help resolve those. But if this signals a reversal of the commitment towards education for all, then I think this would be a major setback. Briefly on Myanmar, there is a functional government there, a central government infrastructure operating at all levels. In that sense, it is a different context within which we are operating, and yet still we are extremely cautious in terms of the terms of engagement that are there. And whether that government now is delivering for its people or not is a different matter. But it is a different, let's say, set of circumstances in which we are able to operate with different approaches, but nevertheless still looking to work directly with communities where we are present, and in a sense engaging in low-level liaison and coordination.
But I mean, how much less work can you do now under this government than, for example, under the previous elected government?
A fraction. And let me be very frank. First of all, international donors suspend their funding, freeze their financial support, and herein lies perhaps one of those dilemmas in the context of Afghanistan. There is no question about resumption of development cooperation right now. That's not on the table. But the capacity of the humanitarian and the development infrastructure of the United Nations, of the international community, is one that can actually operate to a great extent in such a setting, and can provide not only that humanitarian aid, but also that support to allow people to begin to rebuild their own livelihoods, get out of this situation. Sometimes in those moments to cut off funding may actually not be the right and smartest response. It may be the most politically comfortable or expedient. And this is a debate that, you know, in every country we are engaged in. But in the context of Myanmar, I mean, this country was beginning to make very significant progress. And I think just since the military coup, compounded by COVID-19, we have seen a significant deterioration in economic conditions, rising poverty levels, never mind the political repression, the arrests, and also the fighting that is occurring in the country. And from that point of view, we have had to significantly scale back the implementation of the programs that we were implementing.
Right. And I would, unless there's any other questions, I'd just like to follow up on that issue, which you've just been very eloquent about, but taking into account your point about not treading on areas being handled by the UN Special Envoy on Myanmar, which is really more focused on a political process and trying to come up with solutions and mediating on that political front. But actually sitting in Thailand, which most all the journalists in this room are, there's also another issue which is much more about the agencies concerned about humanitarian issues. And separate from any discussion about a humanitarian corridor, Thailand itself faces quite a threat that if there is a further implosion, further, this civil war drives, and we saw it last year with and early this year with a huge wave of refugees coming into Thailand. We're not supposed to call them refugees, but they were. And that in itself could be a problem for Thailand per se. So I wonder how you would see that kind of problem that would actually present as a Thai problem, and it's separate from, this issue of mediation or political solution. I mean, what should Thailand, from UNDP's perspective, what can be done to support the Thais if this happens, and there's every likelihood it could?
Well, let me begin by saying whenever a situation arises where citizens in their own country essentially have to flee their country, it is a humanitarian tragedy. Internal displacement being the first stage, and then essentially having to cross borders. And let us remember, close to 1 million people are currently living on the other side of the Myanmar-Bangladesh border, and are being hosted by a country that has itself repeatedly said this is offering a emergency opportunity for people to have safe haven, but they must be supported in hosting that, and also political resolution must be found. And I think in that experience of Bangladesh, you also recognize the same impacts that any country that has to open its borders in order to allow people to flee from a country automatically incurs a burden. And the international community, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, we in part exist to also help countries when they have to carry that burden. I think it does not take much imagination to say that were large numbers of people to move across borders from Myanmar, this would be, whether for the Kingdom of Thailand or any other country bordering Myanmar, an extraordinary burden to carry. And I think whether one defines that in economic or political terms, I think will depend from one moment to another. What we have established increasingly in a number of countries, for instance, in relation to the Syria conflict, is regional refugee response plans, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and UNDP deploy in tandem a response that is, on the one hand, focused on assisting the refugees, and on the other, supporting host communities also. Because sometimes this is one of the greatest points of tension, that refugees in the emergency are looked after, but the host communities are in fact completely overlooked. And that is why we also have in Bangladesh taken that very much on board. But let me not speculate at this moment, where would Thailand be if? I think in large numbers, it would not be a welcome development, quite clear. On the other hand, I think many of the countries surrounding Myanmar deserve our admiration for having time and again over decades offered safe haven to people who had to flee a repressive military regime. And I think this is a reminder of why the Secretary General continues to call on all parties in Myanmar to return to democratic rule. It is the only way that I believe ultimately we will see, first of all, a decline in conflict, in fighting, and secondly, an opportunity to actually protect the development gains of the last decade and begin to reinvest in the development of the country, not for the benefit of a few, but for the people of Myanmar.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Steiner, and I think on that note, we'll let you get on your way. I think you're returning back to America tonight. So I'd just like to thank you and those who attended. And there will be a video of this event. We didn't live stream it, so just to let you know that. Thank you very
so
much.
Ben. Thank you, and thank you for your interest. Have a good evening.